we are living in probably the most rapidly changing times in the history of mankind. Things we only imagined about, a few decades ago, they're reality today. I can remember, maybe you wasn't this way, but I can remember sitting in school, grade school, elementary school, junior high, thinking about the year 2020. And honest to God, I thought we'd be in spaceships, flying around, hovering, going everywhere. I mean, it just seemed like, man, that's so way out there. But things have changed so rapidly over the last few decades. We got cell phones, we got smart watches, smart TVs, smart thermostats, smart houses, smart mirrors. We got all these smart things, we just don't have smart people to operate them. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we got all these things that have changed. We got more entertainment in our homes than we've ever had. We have it on our smart tablets. You can get it on your phone. We have cameras now. We just bought a Mobicam. Anybody ever heard of that? We bought a Mobicam to put in our house so we can watch our cat and see what our cat does during the day while we're gone. I know we're weird. But we got all this technology, all these devices that we have now. We have cars that can park themselves. Go figure. I mean, we got all of these things happening. Social media has just blown up. I mean, there's so many avenues to social media now. A lot of changes in a short amount of time. And it's kind of like you get in on it or you get left behind it. And you're scratching your head going, wow, I didn't know that happened. Well, just as fast, there's a lot of moral and cultural changes that have happened in our society over the last few decades. It's constantly changing. They're very swift and they're very steady current that's changing in our society today. Things that only 30 to 40 years ago we went, and we blushed. And now, after that, we go and we look at it and we go, that's bad. Or we go, that's not that good. And then it's like, well, it could be worse. And then we got, what's wrong with that? And that's how it's evolved over the last few decades. I mean, we have all these changes. It's the topic of debate of friends. We sit around, we talk about these things. Churches debate it. Education, politics debates it. You choose a side. You fight for your side. We protest. We boycott. We debate. We argue. We spew venomous words and accusations at each side. There's Republicans. There's Democrats. There's left wings. There's right wings. There's the wingless, I guess. I don't know. There's liberals. There's the Tea Party. There's Christians. There's Muslims. There's everything in between. And lines are drawn, and you must choose a side. You must choose between, if you're in or out, you're going to be on the right side or the wrong side. You're going to argue for this or you're going to argue for that. And lines are drawn. And consequently, we can often feel frustrated, confused, torn between the extremes. And we try to stand in the middle and we're pulled in both directions. I love a sign I saw a few months ago. It said there's many a squirrel that lays in the road, flattened in the road, simply because they couldn't make up their mind. And that's the way a lot of us are. We're torn between the two. We don't want to alienate people who need God, nor do we want to compromise our convictions and our biblical beliefs. So as culture shifts, we either get angry, we feel threatened, we feel frustrated, we attack and we condemn other people who disagree with our point of view, we protest, we lash out at the opposition, or we're just tempted to go with the flow. It doesn't matter, let's just, we'll just go with the flow and avoid any cultural conflict. When we're with this group, our position is with them, and when we're with the other group, we side with them, and we just kind of play both sides. Well, so we don't want to offend anyone, we don't want to really stand out, and we certainly don't want to ridicule. We don't want to be labeled a fanatic. We don't want to be labeled a liberal. We don't want to be apathetic, so we just simply play both sides. Well, we're starting a series today, and we're going to be talking about this. How can you stand in our day and age for truth, but how can you do it with grace? How can you stand for truth, but how do you do it with grace? And we see this demonstrated in the life of Jesus over and over and over again. Jesus was a man of truth. I mean, he'd walk into a room and he'd say, here it is, boom. He'd speak the truth. But he always did it with grace. He'd say, woman, you've lived with 7 different men or 5 different husbands, and the one you're with now is not your, and he would speak truth. But he said, hey, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. He spoke truth, but he did so with grace. And another great example of this is found in an Old Testament prophet by the name of Daniel. Daniel was a person who lived and based his life on truth, but his life was characterized by grace. Because here's the thing this morning. This is one of the things I want you to understand. Truth without grace is mean. Truth without grace is mean. Truth, turn or burn, get right or get left. It's my way or the highway. And truth without grace is just plain mean. And on the other side of that coin, grace without truth is meaningless. Well, it's okay. Everybody, you'll be fine. God understands. Everything will be fine. You're doing your best. You're a good person. And when we have grace without truth, it's meaningless. So how do we stand up for truth, but do so with grace? To understand this, I want to take you back to 605 BC, long time ago. The Babylonians and their emperor, Nebuchadnezzar, they invaded and conquered Judah, and they completely destroyed and wiped out the city of Jerusalem. They looted the temple of God, they took the Jewish people captive, and they led them back to Babylon as captives. Among those exiled back to Babylon was some young people, and one of the young people, they think he was probably around 15, 16 years old, was a young person by the name of Daniel. And he had 3 Hebrew friends who were probably in their early teens as well, and they were a part of the group that was taken back to Babylon as captives. But we read where Daniel and his friends, they honored God. They honored him with their words, they honored him with their actions, and they stood out and stood up in character and in conduct because they were resolute and they were respectful. They were committed to truth, but they were also committed to grace. They didn't conform to the demands of the pagan culture. They also didn't act self-righteous and defensive and judgmental. Okay, they didn't conform to the pagan ways, but they wasn't like, well, y'all all going to hell, and we just, it wasn't that type deal. They didn't conform, but they did so with grace. They knew the difference between being right and being righteous. Being right will win you arguments. Being righteous will influence and attract people. There's a difference. Well, bless God, and that you may be right, but you're going to repel people. But if you are righteous and just live it out with grace, it's going to attract people. So through Daniel and his friends, through their steadfast faith and resolve, their commitment to grace and truth, God demonstrated His supernatural power for them and in their behalf, and He honored them because they honored Him. And the result was Daniel, over a period of about 70 years, being a captive in a foreign pagan land, that over those years, Daniel gained the respect of 4 different emperors who were ruling over the Babylonian nation, and he earned their respect. And about 70 years into their captivity, he had demonstrated such truth and grace in his life that finally the last emperor, who was Cyrus, he said, hey, I'm going to let all you captives go back to your homeland of Jerusalem. The same problem that Daniel and his friends experienced in biblical times, I think, continues through our current time today. How do we gracefully remain anchored to truth in the rapids of cultural change that threaten to carry us away in the opposite direction? I want us to look for just a minute of how our enemy attempts to pull us away from truth, to sway us away from the truth. And the first thing is simply this: he renames or relabels us, or tries to. We're all given a name at birth, aren't we? I mean, I hope you're not nameless today. You're given a name at birth. There was something they wrote on a piece of paper called a birth certificate. When you were born, they gave you a name. I was given a name. I was named after a famous actor who played Dracula in horror movies. Isn't that a great way to be named? Go through life as I'm named after Dracula. But there was an actor named Christopher Lee, and this is a story I was told, that I was named after this great Dracula actor. So maybe that's why my teeth kind of stand out in the front. I don't know. Anyway, we'll go on. But we're all named. We're given a name at birth. Then we have cute, funny nicknames that we're given. Growing up in elementary school, my nicknames were Toole Time, Toole Man, Tooley Bird. I mean, I was called all these different things growing up in elementary school, and there were some names that I was given we won't talk about in church today. Unfortunately, society attempts to give us names and labels too. And people grow up in a day and an age, and they're labeled loser. They're labeled a screw-up. They're labeled an addict. They're labeled not good enough. They're labeled damaged goods. And the list goes on and on and on of the labels that people often stick on us. And these labels, they will stick to our hearts, and eventually they'll change the way that we live. Because here's the deal. What we allow to label us often titles the script that we live our lives by. Let me say that again. What we allow people to label us will often, very often, these titles will script the lives that we live by. So like it or not, labels define us. Maybe it was something a parent said to you or labeled you. Maybe it was something a spouse said or labeled you. Maybe it was a friend that said something, or a boss that said something to you, or a teacher or a coach or a co-worker or whoever it was. But they said something and it stuck in you, and it began to change how you saw yourself and how you lived your life. That's why it's important to understand the way Daniel and his friends did, is we're not defined by what people label us. We're defined by our designer. When he made us, he labeled us. And he designed us, and we're designed and we're named by our designer, not our culture. He made and designed us for his purpose, for his reasons. But culture, especially our enemy, he likes to redefine us, to relabel us. And we're bombarded every single day with attempts to rename us or relabel us. You look at the ads on TV. Every ad that comes on your TV is an attempt to relabel us. They say, wear this label, have this emblem on your clothes, use this shampoo and you'll be irresistible, use this toothpaste and people are going to be attracted to your smile. And they give us all these different ads of trying to relabel who we are and redefine who we are. And we see this very clearly in the life of Daniel and his three friends. In the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar, he captures Jerusalem, and then he completely destroys the city and the temple of God, and he takes the treasures from the temple, and he takes the young men, the best of the best, and then they strategically launch a plan to indoctrinate and influence and relabel these captives. And we picked the story up in Daniel 1 and verse 3. It said, then the king ordered that Ashpenaz and chief of staff to bring in to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and the other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Train these young men, the king said. Train the young men in the language and the literature of Babylon. And he goes on, he says, assign them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. The goal for him was simply this. Basically what the king was saying, he said, we want them to think like us, we want them to believe like us, we want them to behave like us. That was the plan. That was the strategy they had. He said, we want to pull the Jewish culture out of them, and we want to put and instill the Babylonian culture in them. And I don't know, maybe that kind of sounds a lot like today. Is the world says, hey, we want you to think like us, we want you to believe like us, we want you to behave like us. We want everybody to be the same. And that's our enemy's goal as well. He wants us to blend in, where there's no distinction between us and the world, where there's no difference between the world's values and wisdom and God's values and wisdom. But listen, if you're never standing out and you're always blending in, we're probably not truly committed to the truth and to following Jesus. I heard something as a kid, and I've heard it all my life. It says, if it looks like a pig, it smells like a pig, it must be a pig. And I think so often when we try to blend and be like everything and everyone else, we become what we try to blend in to be. First thing Nebuchadnezzar does is he changed their name. I thought this was so interesting. It was customary for captors to have their name changed by the ones who captured them, and it was a sign of ownership. It was saying, hey, I own you now. I renamed you. I own you. And the names they were given, these captives, the names they were given were to crush and remove any sign of their identity, of Israel's identity. It was to mock their heritage. It was to turn the truth inside out. Their names, their new names that they were given were idolatrous. It says Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah, and the chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. He said, Daniel, which means God is my refuge. He said, your new name is Belshazzar, which means lady, protect your king. He said, Hanani, your name was Yahweh's been gracious, but we're going to change it to Shadrach, and it means I am fearful of God. And Hanani, yours is Yahweh has been gracious to me. He said, we're changing your name to Shadrach, or to Meshach. I am despised, unloved. And Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped me. We're changing yours to Abednego, which means a servant of Nebo. They were stripped of their possessions. They were taken thousands of miles from their homeland. They were placed in a pagan society. And now they're changing their names. Their old names were tied to the worship of the one true God, Yahweh. Their new names were tied to the worship of pagan gods. So every time someone called their new name, it was a painful reminder that you don't serve Yahweh anymore, but you serve our gods. But what Nebuchadnezzar didn't realize was you can change a name, but you cannot change an identity. These young men understood it didn't matter what label they were given. What mattered most was what God called them. And God said, I've chosen you. I've redeemed you. And I've given you your name. So the enemy attempted first to change their name or to relabel them. The second thing he did is he changed their diets. He changed their diets. And that's our enemy's plan. He wants to change who we are, and he wants to change what we do. He wants to change who you are and what you do. And listen to what it says. The king assigned them daily rations of food and wine from his own kitchen. Now, eating from a king's table, that's got to be pretty good, right? Kings didn't just get by on scraps and microwave dinners. Kings ate well. And he said, you're going to be fed from the king's table. And we're like, well, that's good. That's a good thing. We're going to have good food. We're going to dine well. We're eating from the king's table. But what they didn't understand was the food from the king's table, the meat and the wine, was actually food that had been offered to pagan idols and had been dedicated to them. Changing the diet, it seems such a small thing, such an innocent thing. But Daniel realized that it was an attempt to redefine and relabel them. And how easy it would have been to justify this one. You're going to eat from the king's table, his food. And we're like, okay, everybody's got to eat, right? I mean, we all got to have something. We all got to eat. And it would have been so easy to justify this. I mean, it's not going to hurt anyone, and it's good food, and God created the food, right? I mean, so it's got to be a good thing. And it's just a little thing. I mean, everybody's got to eat, and God is going to provide us good food from the king's table. But it had been so easy for Daniel not to rock the boat and just say, okay, it's just food, it's a little thing. It had been so easy for him to just bend and blend on this one. I mean, just a name change and a little dietary adjustment. These are little things. It's not like they were asking him to do some big, wicked, ugly, sinful, nasty thing. It was just little things, just a little compromise. But how many of you know that the big things never start out as big things? In fact, in my life, when I think of my sins, my hang-ups, things I battle with, they all started out as small things. A small bend here, maybe a little compromise there, just kind of overlook just this once. We think it's not that big a deal, and just this once, and no one will really know, or no one will really be hurt. It's not going to hurt anybody, and before long we're ensnared we're addicted, we're bound, and we're someone we thought we'd never be, and we're doing stuff we never thought we would do. Maybe that's what Daniel understood. And maybe that's why he didn't compromise, and maybe that's why we have this verse, and this is the one I wanted to get to. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. You read some translations, it says, and Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. In other words, Daniel stood up. He was true to his faith. He stood up, not defensively, not belligerently, not self-righteously, but he stood up with grace. So how do we stand for truth? But how do we do it with grace? And that is, we make a predetermined decision, an advanced decision that we will stand for truth. The enemy can rename us, but he can't change us. That's our decision. That's our choice. Daniel had decided long before the king's meal was ever offered to him how he would respond to the opportunities to sin or the opportunities to give in to temptation. He already worked this out. He had already made his decision. I love the words of Proverbs. In Proverbs 22, it said, a prudent man foresees the difficulties ahead and prepares for them. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. It's deciding and preparing before you're ever faced with temptation or a situation. And if you haven't decided prior to and settled it beforehand, then when you're tempted to look at something you shouldn't look at, or talk about someone you shouldn't talk about, or you're tempted to cheat on something, or be less than honest, or you're tempted to compromise in some little area of your life, you're going to find it very, very difficult to resist and very easy to compromise and give in the moment. And it usually starts with something that doesn't seem that big of a deal, like food or something small. It's just a little bend, a little compromise that leads to bigger, more serious things. Daniel stood up for truth, but he also did it with grace. And here's how he did it with grace, because Daniel not only determined his stand, but Daniel had a plan. He not only determined, I'm going to stand for truth, but he had a plan in place that he could do that. And this is where we read, he said, when they offered him the food, he went and he asked the chief of staff permission. I love this. He went to the chief of staff and he asked for permission. He didn't go in and say, bless God, I'm a child of God and I'm not eating this mess. And you know, he didn't go in demanding and defensive and judgmental. He simply went in and he asked for permission. He said, I want permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. And then after he did that with grace and humility, he said, here's what I propose to do. It's one thing to take a stand, but we need a plan for how we will stand. I'll not get caught up in gossip about other people, so I better have an exit strategy in place so when these people or this topic comes up, I can gracefully excuse myself. I'll not abuse alcohol and medication, so I better come up with a plan to reroute my drive home or to clear my house of stuff or to not associate with the friends that are drawing me in to this kind of lifestyle. I'll not watch this. I'll not look at that. So I better delete the apps or disconnect from the internet or be accountable to someone. I will not overeat, or I will eat healthy. So I'll have a plan to get rid of the M&Ms and, oh, God forbid, the Little Debbies. I'll have a plan. It's great to take a stand, but be resolved. Be resolved. Have a plan and be able to implement it with grace. Don't argue and debate the truth. Daniel didn't argue and debate the truth with the chief of staff, but he extended grace by offering an alternative. He said, we'll have veggies and water. Veggies and water. You evaluate us 10 days later, we'll come back, and if we're as healthy and look as good and as fresh as the others, then you'll know that our alternative was the best alternative. Daniel determined in his heart to stand for truth, and he had a plan to accomplish it. And we have no clear values and no clear beliefs, and when we're faced with temptation or pressure from society to bend or give in some area of our life, we find it hard to stand in the moment. But Daniel not only had courage to stand for what he believed, he He had a plan for it. And if he hadn't had the courage to stand for what he believed, nothing would have happened. Listen to me, if Daniel had not had a plan and stood for truth, there wouldn't be a book of Daniel in the Bible. There would be no story there. There'd be no Daniel in the lion's den and no 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. All that would have been deleted and left out. There would have been no historic events taking place, and there would have been no life change happening and no nations changed. Had one man not decided to predetermine what was really important and what would honor God. And as a result, an entire nation was influenced, and eventually Daniel and his friends were promoted to places of honor. And here, this is so big. I'd rather be remembered for standing up than forgotten for blending in. I'd rather be remembered for standing for something and doing so with grace and humility than for blending in and nobody ever remembering who I was. I love the way the story goes. It said Daniel, he decided he wouldn't defile himself. A personal commitment to truth and grace. He wasn't telling everybody else how to live. He wasn't telling everybody else what they needed to stand for. He wasn't telling everybody else their business. He said, as for me, he decided I would not defile myself with the king's meat. He wasn't protesting, he wasn't boycotting, he wasn't arguing, he wasn't judging, he wasn't condemning, he wasn't being self-righteous. He was simply stated that he wouldn't defile himself, and he had a plan to accomplish it, which left the door open for him to extend grace to others. He didn't preach a sermon to the chief of staff on idolatry and on sin. He offered the chief of staff a gracious alternative. And he said, hey, I'm not protesting, but try us on veggies and water and see what happens. His stand for truth, covered in grace, earned him the respect not only of the chief of staff, but eventually of the emperor himself. And he was promoted to like second in command of the nation. You say, well, why are we talking about all this Daniel stuff and the Daniel thing? Because I believe with all my heart, I believe if we can get this Daniel thing down, okay? If we ever hope to impact our culture, if we ever hope to influence our society, it'll start when we resolve in our own heart to live by truth and the principles of God's Word. And we've settled it in advance. We've settled the issues and our values, and we've clarified our values in our own heart, and we live them out, not in self-righteousness and not in judgment or condemnation, but we live them out with humility and grace. And when we do, that's when people, rather than argue with us and debate us, they'll respect us. And they'll know that there is something to this faith we claim and something to the one we serve. And oh, by the way, the end of the story of this first part, the result of Daniel standing for truth and doing it with grace, it said when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, because they determined to stand for truth, and they did so with grace. And isn't that what our families need? Isn't that what our community needs? Isn't that what our society needs? Isn't that what our world needs? Is people who are determined to stand for truth and walk in and offer grace to others. And God will look down and He'll say, now there's a group of people I can work and do miraculous things through. My prayer this morning as we start this series is that we'll walk out of here resolved in our hearts to stand for truth, to walk in grace, and to see God do some incredible things through our lives. Let's bow for prayer.